meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and salvation. Amen. Often over the years of my ministry, almost 40 now, I have people who ask, seems to be a perennial question, they want to know how long does it really take to write a sermon? Well, I don't subscribe to sermons.com, so I have to come up with it on my own, and some weeks it comes quickly. You know, you can write a whole sermon in an hour. It's like a hot knife through butter, and at other times you struggle and you struggle and you struggle. I remember a homiletics professor who, while I was in seminary, told me that one of the things we should always remember as we write sermons is don't preach on the big texts right away. You know, the ones we all know, the Lord is my shepherd, all those kinds of things. Instead, give yourself some time in terms of learning to preach, that your experience and your members' experience can kind of merge and bring out the depth that is found in those passages as we relate to them through, all we go through in life. Well, this was the case with our text for this morning. I've been carrying it around for a long time. It's not a very familiar passage. I don't think most people even have paid attention to it. But it is one of particular relevance, as I read it this week, it is one of particular relevance, I think, for our lives in these times, these days. We find, Matthew tells us, we find Jesus addressing three communities, Bethsaida, Chorazin, and Capernaum. All communities that he was very familiar with and who were familiar with him. After all, he spent 9/10 of his ministry, those 3 years, living in Capernaum, and the other towns were in close proximity. So it's not a great leap to surmise that these people probably had more face time with Jesus than anyone except his closest disciples. But when you read this text, it's pretty clear, it's very obvious that something's not right. Something's got Jesus all worked up. Something's wrong, because what Jesus says to them is not the usual words we expect of comfort or love. Rather, they are harsh words of judgment and condemnation. And they allude, or at least point toward, a fate, a firestorm that would consume them worse than that which consumed Sodom and Gomorrah. This is very serious stuff. But I thought to myself, what could these people have done to deserve Jesus' ire? Where did the gentle shepherd go? What did they do? And as I reflected and meditated and thought and prayed, the answer that came to me is they did nothing. Now, when I say they did nothing, I'm not trying to be facetious or sarcastic or anything. But they did nothing. Their sin wasn't some evil that they committed, like Sodom and Gomorrah, or some blasphemy that they had spoken. Their nothing was a deaf ear. Now, don't get me wrong. We know that these people liked Jesus, and they liked what he said, and certainly what he did for them, the healings, the miracles. They ate those up like a kid in a candy store. But when the going got tough, there was nothing. Now, let's give these folks, at least for a few minutes, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. After all, we all know that when the world comes pounding on us and crashing all around us, our thoughts, we don't hear very well because our thoughts are all preoccupied with the things happening about us. Life in those times wasn't a piece of cake. People worked from dawn till dusk just to survive. And what little income they may have made, Rome levied a heavy tax on them and their own temple as well. You couldn't say, well, these people are upper class, middle class, lower class, because there was an upper class of 1% and everybody below them was just a matter of degrees of poverty. Which makes sense that Jesus, when he taught them to pray, said, ask God to give you this day your daily bread. He wasn't kidding. Day to day, moment to moment, they had a lot going on. A lot of things going on that took up their time and energy and supplanted perhaps what Jesus had to say. I'm reminded of a husband who said, you know, my wife tells me I have two faults. The first one is that I don't listen, and the second one is, well, you know, it's something else. But even if I give them the benefit of the doubt and empathize with these three communities, I have to say that it's still hard to reconcile our usual image of Jesus with this exhibition of anger. You know, what happened to the gentle Savior that we've come to know and love? But if you read farther, there's a clue. If you read ahead, you see that there's something more. Because Jesus adds, or says, at least in the way that I would have him say it now. He says, you know, here's the deal. I offered you hope and support. I labored to get you to look up instead of constantly looking down. I played the flute so you could dance, and you just sat there. You just sat there like a lump on a rock. I entered your world. I lived with you. I ate with you. I suffered with you. I empathized with your condition. And you made me sing solo. And even when you did sing, your words were not the ones I offered, but those of an entitled child. Everybody hates me. Nobody loves me. Guess I'll just eat worms. So I not only empathize with these people, let me tell you, I commiserate with Jesus as well. Because I too have days when, you know, my temper flares and wears thin as I ask myself, and I run out of patience. I ask myself, is any of it worth the effort? Did I matter or make a difference at all? You know, it's a struggle sometimes. And life can be overwhelming. I suspect it feels that way for a lot of people these days. And I recognize, at least for myself, when I'm not responding as I want to or as my calling would have me do, the words of faith and hope seem dim. It's like being anesthetized. You know, you see things around you, you know what's happening, but you're emotionless and unable to face them. You can't handle anymore. You're so distraught, you become numb to the point that you don't care. And if I feel this way, I'm sure many of you do too. And if I and you feel this way, then we are infecting other people, because this is contagious. This lack of joy and the spirit to dance can even be malignant. We are going through so much more than it seems we can handle. We know the tune. We know the tune, but we don't even have the energy left to hum it. I think that's where we are as a society these days. Torpidity in our society. We have pandemics, protests, acts of racial violence, unemployment, tension in and between governments and nations. These are days when it can feel so tough that when Jesus says or gives us that judgment that, we're going to go down in smoke, it's almost like a mercy killing. And yet, if you look at this closely, the inference here is we shouldn't give up. That we cannot allow the forces of darkness to keep us from at least humming the tune. There's still time to dance. There's still more that lays ahead, because we know that if we don't, then we too, like these 3 cities, are doomed. We too know, like these 3 villages, that our story is not going to end well. When I was at the Abbey on Iona, the island of Iona in Scotland, I noticed that they employed a number of people with disabilities. And I thought to myself, life must be tough off the island for these folks, because some of them were rather severe. And so it was interesting on a particular night when I joined the rest of the community, and they did some Irish dancing in the hall with singing and, the Celtic music, and they were just having a raucous time. And I saw, as they danced around, I saw people who were physically whole dancing hand in hand with those whom life had broken. I was aware of a young man with autism, another who I believe had progeria, which is a premature aging disease. Still others had disfigured limbs or limps, but it didn't stop them from taking the hands of those people and joining the dance. But I sat there. I sat there as this portrait of joy and happiness swirled in front of me. And as I did, I chanced to have a young woman who kind of came around with the circle, and as she did, she looked at me and she extended her arm and her hand to me, inviting me to join in. As her hand was extended and her sleeves drawn back, I glimpsed scars that were left from cutting. It's odd, isn't it, that when we are most overwhelmed, we turn on ourselves. Nonetheless, she was dancing, and she invited me, she beckoned me to quit sitting there and join the dance as well. To this day, friends, I regret that I did not accept her invitation. I did not rise from my torpid state on that chair to dance. And nothing was stopping me except me. The music played on, and I didn't stand up. The voices continued to sing, and I chose not to join the chorus. I live with that. And whose fault was it but mine? There are many interesting and very, very human stories, especially in the Old Testament. One of which you can find in the book of Joshua, where the Hebrew slaves, former Hebrew slaves of Egypt, after they have wandered 40 years in the desert, now they stand on the precipice of fulfilling God's promise to give them a new land, a new place, a new home. The only problem was between where they were and where they needed to be or to get was the Jordan River. Naturally, since the last time they were in this kind of a predicament, God had parted the Red Sea that they could escape from Pharaoh and get to the other side. So they turned to God and said, okay, God, do your thing. And this time, God was silent. God said, no. What? No. Nothing is going to happen until one of you has the faith and courage to put your foot in. I'm not doing it for you. You must take ownership. It's time to grow up. And the story concludes by telling us that when the first toe touched the River Jordan, the water parted, and they were able to step into the promised land. You know, God is always more willing to help than we are to ask. God's hand, like that young woman's hand and arm, are constantly extended. And if you look closely, you can see the scars that God bears from life, our lives as well. But we will never get on to the next phase of life, the new normal, whatever that is, individually or corporately, if we don't join hands and help each other so we can all stand up. I recently saw a sign that read, "The time is always now." The time is always now. The time is now for us to dance. Amen. To get